Greetings, gamers. Tim here again, and today I wanted to talk about different mechanics that are being used in order to shore up failed dice rolls. That is, ways of giving players the option to succeed when they want their characters to succeed. The most common form of solution to preventing failure when it's not required is a point system. They go back quite far. I believe the 007 James Bond RPG, the DC Heroes RPG, the first one, Marvel Superheroes, which is one of my favorites, uses karma. And they give the player some control over the outcome of the dice. Now, good or bad, I generally prefer that them be good because I like players being able to choose those moments when it's really important to them to succeed. Uh, but I've been thinking about it. I've always thought that points, while they are a currency and an empowering currency, they have to move fairly fluidly in order to basically truly give the players power. For example, I'm playing Deadlands Reloaded, and that's probably going to come up a few times. I'm enjoying it immensely, but bennies are somewhat limited in play. You only get so many a game session. They're in Deadlands Reloaded. They are basically of different values, different effects they can do: white, red, blue, and then there's a chip you get for having a heroic, triumphant moment against a big bad that is quite valuable. And I ended up spending one of those to try and take down a foe, which it was probably not a really fair exchange, and the game master, mentioned that. But I used it anyway because that's how I wanted it used, and it was my last Benny. But it didn't really have as big an impact as I would like to have had. I would like to have had it truly be a triumphant moment for the expense I was paying. And it wasn't. It did influence play slightly. It allowed us to actually wound a character who was incredibly tough in play, and we were basically all brawling. It was a brawling situation because we're supposed to be going underground to take on a underground boxing, blood sport ring, which is what this was. This was us to get in the door. But one of our foes was particularly tough, and none of us could seem to damage her. And I realized that damage would impair her a little bit and make it harder for her to hurt us, as well as, fundamentally make it easier to hurt her. Again, because we'd already gotten past the shaken, etc., etc. The problem is, though, that because bennies don't come often, players like me tend to want to hoard them. And hoarding them doesn't actually get them used. The economy is not functional. It's a broken economy. Karma, as written in Marvel Superheroes, is a functional economy. A slow one, kind of a sluggish one. And I've always believed that the best way to handle that is to up the number of points you give players to shift play. Now, it takes a lot more to impact play in karma points than it does in bennies, because bennies have a very significant effect, mostly. But unfortunately, it's not always turning a failure into a triumph. Sometimes it's just making a slightly better success, or turning a failure into a marginal success, or getting a really high failure, depending on how they're used. And it made me think about this because I have seen players who would consistently, on one game night, their dice just do not function randomly for them. They're rolling consistently low or consistently high in games where the opposite is what you want. If you want high, you're rolling low. If you want low, you're rolling high. And the problem with that is that without a functional economy, without a active economy, there's no way to fix that. A sluggish economy, a non-functioning economy of resources that do not impact play aren't really useful. And I've been thinking, what about a resource, or perhaps just a sort of metagame option that allows someone who tabulates, like, say I get 5 failures and I keep track of them, 5 failures in a row. On my sixth failure, the GM says, "Go ahead and re-roll that die again. You have earned uh, a, mm, what do you want to call it? Consistency breaker or a limit breaker of some kind. I don't actually want to use the term limit break, but the idea is basically you are busting out of that bad chain of rolls. And in that case, either the roll is a free roll that it doesn't have any penalties to it, or additional modifiers. Whereas, like if you rolled 5 times to succeed at one task, you might have them in some games. It might even get a bonus because you're trying to break that consistency of dice rolling that's functionally making your character non-influential in the game. And fundamentally, that's frustrating. It is very frustrating to play a character in a role-playing game where your character cannot influence play at all, where you're not successfully impacting the game. Now, sometimes it's the choices a player makes, and there's nothing that can be done if the player is consistently making choices that the other 5 of the 6 players are not making. I've had that happen a few times. I've had players who they really don't want to go rescue the princess or save the day. They just want to go make a bundle of money. And when the other 5 are going to go rescue the princess, I try and give that 6th player an impetus, an apple to lure them along. But if they refuse to still follow because it's rescuing the princess and they don't really want to do that, or whatever equivalent there is to rescuing the princess, there's not much I can do. And as a GM, I cannot consistently run 2 separate game scenarios. I can briefly allow players to split up and do different things in different places. But if they are consistently doing that, I'm going to either have to ask that aberrant player to either go along or make a character that can go along. And if the player, cannot do that, then they're not going to have fun. They're going to literally have to sit there and watch the other players play, because I, as a GM, am one person and I'm dealing with 6 other people's patterns. And while I can do, or more, actually, and while I can do that to a certain extent, there is a limit to even what I am capable of. Any GM is capable of. Now, if you could get 2 or 3 GMs in a game, you might be able to split them up that way. But if you're doing that, why aren't you just running separate games to begin with? Running for these 3 and running for those 3 and whatever. Now, you got to understand, I talk to players before I start running things most of the time, unless people say, well, let's just do this game. And I'm like, okay, I can run that, but what do you want from that? Well, let's just do this game. Okay, we're playing D&D. Fine, we're just going to do D&D. Well, for me, there are different kinds of play that shape even D&D. Some people prefer just let's stay in the dungeon and we're always doing dungeons, and some people like it to be more of an epic fantasy, beginning, middle, and end type adventure, so it feels more story-like. But the thing boils down to is if a player chooses not to influence play, there's nothing really I can do about it. But if they're trying to influence play, if they're trying to have an impact on the game scenario, and their dice or the mechanics are not letting them, then something is seriously wrong and it needs to be fixed. And in my opinion, most point systems are good, but they're still fundamentally a patch to a system that did not function entirely 100% as it probably should be. Now, I'm not trying to belittle those games. I mean, because in many ways, sometimes that's the only real solution you have in order to fix it. Is it's going to be a patch. It's necessary. There's not a lot of other ways to do it. For instance, in Hearts and Souls, my superhero game, players can monologue or banter depending on the situation, either pep talking themselves or trying to undermine their opponent with banter that effectively gives them a secondary chance, another reroll to succeed. But that requires a person investing into a character that will do monologues and banter. There are options in Hearts and Souls if somebody doesn't want to banter and monologue, but they're costly. And there's a reason for that, because banter and monologue are very big parts of what I feel is important in comic book gaming, which is, have fun, be active. You're not just sitting there, I'm going to roll to hit. No, you're taunting the other person. You're looming over them as a dark shadow, and whispering in their ear. You're doing things that are active, that are more than just, I'm going to punch him. And that's kind of the idea of the mechanics in Hearts and Souls, is to drive forward and give players influence to do greater things. And I've got some other games that do similar things, but I'm working on one now, and it brings me back to that limit break idea, to the idea of breaking a consistent chain of failures. Is there a way to do it that is not points, and this is not my Hearts and Souls solution? Is there another way to help a person earn a success instead of consistent failures? Now, I know, for example, the Marvel Saga role-playing game, the Marvel Superhero Adventure game, aka Marvel Saga, uses cards. So it gives you a functional number of preset results, and depending on how you play those, if you play them tactically enough, you can get successes where you want them. But sometimes your hands are bad even in that. You have to deal with it. It happens. The game is not a story 100%. No matter how you shape it, sometimes that makes it fun, because sometimes having that character die at that last moment, holding off the bad guys, is interesting and fun, and people don't always realize that in a story unless they're like the author and they're trying to make a dramatic point. But players are not always writers, and neither are GMs. Sometimes they are just players and GMs of games, and so they don't realize that this dramatic moment might be cool right here. And instead, we have mechanics in games to create that kind of drama and create failure, because we don't just want success, 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 success. I mean, honestly, why play if there's not a challenge to it, if there's not some reason and risk for that character? And that's what brings me to, what kind of systems do you suggest? What kind of ideas would you have to break a chain of failed rolls? Or, for example, would you be interested in breaking a chain of successful rolls? If somebody was just basically hogging the spotlight because they got successes every time they sat down and rolled for something, would you like to break that? Or maybe allow it to switch to the spotlight moment to other players, to give the other players a chance to shine? I've been thinking about different ways to do that. For example, like, you could roll a success and then award it to another player who has an idea you would like to see done. Helping them out effectively. There are also, for example, just the meta of, okay, I, the GM, have seen you roll 5 times and fail. This time you get a bonus of +2. Or you get another free reroll. Because, man, that sucks. That's not fair. But where do we draw the line? What kind of systems work for this? What kind of systems don't work for this? How do we create tension, but also create influence in the game space, in the outcomes of results? We want tension. We want, sometimes there's a chance to be failure, but we also want the potential for outcomes even when a person is mechanically not getting that influence on play. There might be, as I said, a patch like points that works very well. And believe me, I'm not belittling it. When I say patch, I mean a fix that's welded on the outside that keeps the thing running. Whether it's pretty or not, I don't, that depends on the point system. But, we're fixing damage to something. We're fixing it so it works right. So, well, what do you think? Give me a holler, post a video, write me a note. I don't care. Just give me ideas for what you think of for breaking those consistent failures or other types of unlikely but possible outcomes that rob players of influence. Thanks, guys.